Good day, everybody. We want to talk about appraisal forms and some aspects that we may not have talked about as yet, but they're as important and give you some features on what we look for in both appraisal forms, but also in the presentation of appraisal forms. I'm going to start with talking about the desirable features of an appraisal form. First, though, I'll give you a bit of a background on what we're looking for in appraisals and appraisal forms. What we've learned thus far is that appraisals really should be much more frequent. We've talked about the frequency aspect of more than once a year, and so when we hear the term the annual appraisal form, the annual appraisal process, we should move from this term of annual. In fact, the term should be somewhat open, and that we need to do appraisal forms when we feel that there's a justification for doing so. There should be a minimum, but there should be a more ongoing approach to appraisal forms. One of the benefits of appraisal forms, of course, is that we look at where the organization wants to go and how each person within the organization is tasked with assisting the organization in getting there and obtaining that direction. It's one of the factors that we need to get across, is that it's more of an iterative type of process, which is it's continual. Some do a appraisal form of some sort on a monthly basis. That's certainly laudatory. And if you go on a monthly basis, you would imagine that the appraisal form is much simpler, much more direct and to the point. And we'll talk about those features as we look at this slide that we have from the Chicago Business Press. As we have a more brief, direct, to the point evaluation, we can do it much quicker, and the process itself can be anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes a month. That's certainly not an exorbitant amount of time to spend with an employee. So we see that we're doing these appraisals much quicker, the form is much more simple, and the process maybe is seen as not as burdensome. The only burdensome part remaining is the conversation that we have with our employees, and we'll talk about that as well, but that's where some of the conflict comes in, especially if you have to relay unfortunate information about an employee's performance. However, I'll leave you with this thought as we move towards the appraisal form, and that is, if an employee is not doing their job, we should not feel angst or trepidation about pointing that out to the employee. In fact, it's our responsibility, and the employee, by virtue of not doing their job, should expect that type of discussion with their supervisor. And also, other employees who are doing their job may feel it's unfair that the employee who isn't is not having a conversation with their employer about the way and the manner in which they're doing their job. In fact, in reality, an employee not doing their job is impacting others who are, and that could affect the salaries and benefits and the very future of those employees who are doing their jobs by those who aren't. So we as supervisors and managers have a responsibility, certainly an obligation, to ensure that those who aren't doing their job are talked to, so that if they are unaware they're not doing their job, they're now aware. But if they are aware they're not doing their job and simply not doing it, they could be put on notice that that is not only impacting their job, but others as well. So let's now turn our attention to the evaluation form. The evaluation form has a number of features. As we see in this slide, there's 8. Several I'm going to highlight because I think they're among the most important. First is simplicity. Most evaluation forms are, in fact, the ones that have went through some kind of a strategy and rigor as to what the intention of those forms are. They're very simple. They're about a page. Most of the page is checkbox, and at least for some type of written form, but really it's a quick overview on how you assess and judge somebody's performance. Given the simplicity nature of the evaluation, It should not take long, not only to complete the form on behalf of the supervisor, but also to present that form on behalf of the supervisor to the employee. Simplicity really is the rule. I've seen some organizations that I've consulted with that their form is anywhere from 3 to 5 pages, requires quite a bit of narrative, of writing on behalf of the supervisor. It's no wonder that either the form is not done or is not done properly. It's also no wonder that so many supervisors want to avoid that process. It's not one that they relish because of the amount of time that it takes. So simplicity really is an issue that we want to relay to those who are building the evaluation forms, but also those who are utilizing it. So simplicity is a key. The second is actually on the bottom, which is time orientation. We've talked already in these few minutes about the time orientation, but at a minimum, evaluation should be done on a quarterly basis. Some, as mentioned, do it on a monthly basis, and that's perfectly appropriate. But a quarterly evaluation system and process should be the norm for an organization. The principal reason, as we've mentioned earlier, is because if you have an evaluation system where it's annual, then that means that you're really formally talking to an employee on an annual basis. If they are starting to stray from their performance, from the line that you've created that they should follow, if they're straying from that process, it could be months, upwards of a year, before you correct that performance and the employee's performance is back on track, of at least in terms of the expectations. But if you talk to an employee on a quarterly basis related to your expectations and their performance, if they are straying from that line, you can more quickly assess their performance and ensure that they adapt to the expectations that you have. So simplicity's the first, time orientation is the second. The third desirable feature of the evaluation process and form is communication. These forms are really a communication device between the supervisor and the employee. What that means is that we should have a tool, create a tool that allows us to have a conversation between a supervisor and employee so that performance and how we judge performance lies at the forefront of the documents that we use. So communication, a form that allows us communication, should always be at the forefront of a mind of a supervisor and also of the employee. The employee wants to know how they're going to be judged. Often, the results of a performance evaluation process is going to relate to a person's salary and compensation in general. Also, possible promotions. So it's important that the form allows for this type of communication so both sides of the table, the supervisor and the employee, leave understanding how that performance is judged and assessed. So it's a communication vehicle. Given that it should be simple, that the time frame should be quarterly, and that the communication really should be at the heart of the device that we use, then what should we then use in terms of the form itself? We see a number of relevancy, descriptive, adaptive, and those are all quite important. What we should really come across from in relation to this form is the comprehensive and clarity of it. The 2 C's, I call it. Comprehensive in that it should discuss all aspects of an employee's performance, and then clarity in that it really should get across in a very clear manner how an employee is being judged and assessed. Comprehensive means that if you take the evaluation, what the obligation of an employee is included in the evaluation. So each of the most important aspects of a person's duty should be included in the evaluation. That fulfills the comprehensive. Clarity means that there's a clear link between an employee's performance and the expectations of their performance. Both those are actually quite simplistic. Comprehensive could be one sentence about the important aspects of a person's job. The last part is clarity, which is you clearly detail whether they did or did not meet that performance and to what level. In general, clarity is enhanced when you have a very definitive way in which you measure performance. We typically like to see 4 categories. We use an even number of categories when assessing an employee, not an odd. We don't use an odd level of categories because if we do, most, or at least many, of raters will go kind of towards the middle. But if you have an odd or an even number, then you have definitive lines between 1, 2, 3, and 4. In fact, if you use odd number of categories, 5 categories, you'll usually have something like superior, exceeds, meets. And what we have seen and research shows is that most are going to get a meets or an exceeds. In other words, a 3 or a 4. If you have 4 categories, which is an even number, then you have something like exceeds, meets, challenging or approaching meets, and then does not meet. So you can see that there's more of a stark contrast within each category. Talk about that more as well. But you'll find that more would get towards the 3 as opposed to the 4, and if you go into the 2, that means that somebody's not meeting the expectations. In fact, the third category, so if you have an exceeds and meets, is often meets, whereas if you had an odd, that would be a 3 or in the middle. So a meets is more than the middle, but many employees would say meets just doesn't give a great description of my performance. I believe I exceed. You can see the stark differences between exceeds and meets. So of these 8 desirable features, I've really highlighted 3, maybe 4. It's simple, the time frame is often, and there's a comprehensive nature of it, which means it addresses each aspect of performance, and there's a clear link between performance and how performance is judged. So how do we determine the overall ratings of an individual? Because that's what so many employees want to be informed about. How are you going to judge my performance? Again, the consequences of judging that performance are quite stark and have a considerable repercussion to an employee, not only for their financial security, but for their future performance as well. Future performance would allow them to be promoted, if not in this organization. If they have quite a good evaluation, they can take that evaluation to their next firm or organization. Yes, they're portable. I always tell employees that you should, especially if you get a laudatory evaluation, you should keep that for your future. In fact, when you apply for subsequent jobs, it's a good idea to attach your current evaluation, especially, again, if it's laudatory. Instead of doing a background investigation of an employee, if you have an evaluation that's laudatory, that will follow you throughout your career. And that certainly eliminates or maybe diminishes the need for a prospective employer to look at a previous employer because you have an evaluation that attests to how well you've done your job. When we determine the overall rating, there is judgment. And so no matter if we use checkboxes, we look at evaluations as subjective or objective, and we try to make them as objective as possible. But at the end of the day, there's an element of judgment that comes into play. Within our courses, if you're a teacher, no matter what level, we tend to use rubrics. Rubrics are seen as or believed to be more fair. A student can look at the rubric and see where they did and did not do well. But there's a high level of subjectivity that comes from using rubrics, because at one point, a faculty member needs to judge your performance and needs to state whether you're in the higher levels of the rubric or the lower levels of the rubric. And the same goes for the performance evaluation process. At some point, there is a need for some subjective type of assessment. So although we try to create a tool that leads one to believe that it's objective, there's a high degree, in my opinion, of subjectivity that comes into play. This is one reason that we really need to have a positive working relationship with our supervisor. Our supervisor at some point is going to have to make a subjective judgment about ourselves. We hope that it's tied to our performance. We hope that there's a considerable degree of data, we use documentation, to attest that the subjective decision related to our performance is really based on objective data, we hope. But if your job is one that doesn't lead to objective decisions, for instance, if you're judged by your performance in relation to selling a product, and you can maybe make a statement that you're expected to increase sales 5%, you increase sales 6%, there really isn't much of a discussion or a deliberation related to your performance. The result meaning that there's clear numbers, we call that quantitative data, that indicates that you've performed in an acceptable or laudatory manner. However, if your job is more qualitative in nature, which means you're not going to rely on a number to detail whether you've performed well or not, then you allow for a higher degree of subjectivity on your evaluation. For instance, if you perform some level of customer service and it's really debatable as to whether customers are happy or not happy with your performance, if you feel like you provided them the service that they need in an acceptable manner or unacceptable manner, that level of subjectivity can show in your evaluation, and that is why you have to have a very solid, positive relationship with your supervisor. As an aside, you also want to make sure that you work for a supervisor who's seen as decent and honorable, a good person. A good person will call the game fairly, will eliminate any bias. So if you work for a supervisor who's seen as a decent and honorable person, then the game is going to be called fair, and your performance is going to be judged fairly. And that's what we want, right? We want to be treated fairly, equally. We also want to treat others fairly and equally. But if you work for a manager who does not call the game fairly, who does not score the game fairly, then you are at their whim, you're at their mercy in some way as to whether they're going to judge your performance in a fair and equitable manner. So we do create these evaluation systems that at least the effort is to minimize the subjectivity of a person's decision and to maximize the objectivity. But there is a level that we just certainly can't avoid. Because at some point, somebody has to check the box as to what level they're judging our performance, and we hope that we're going to be judged, again, in a fair way. That's where this mechanical strategy comes into play, where we consider scores assigned to each section. We weight them as well. Weighting is something we use in college as well. For instance, some scores, some assignments are weighted higher than others. So if you have a fairly easy assignment, you may get a 100% at it, but as far as the weight or the portion of that assignment that's going to count for your final grade, it may be a smaller percentage. Quizzes, for instance, even though you may get 100% on a quiz, that may only be 10% of your final grade. But if you do well on a midterm, it may be 30% of your grade. So although you got 100% on a quiz, and say, for instance, an 80% on a midterm, since that midterm is weighted 40% of your final grade, and the quiz is only rated 10%, you don't add the two together and then averaged for a final score. The quiz on the midterm is going to be exponentially more. It's the same when you do an evaluation system for an employee. There's certain parts of their job that are weighted more. In other words, they count more in the final determination of your evaluation. So though you may have 6 duties, and let's say you performed 5 of them in an exemplary or exceeds manner, the one that you did not do well is actually the most important aspect of your job. Let's say, for instance, sales. So you may have done the other 5 perfectly appropriate, but the one in terms of overall sales has went down. That may impact your overall rating as an employee, and you may be rated down because of the manner in which the sales fell. You can actually get a did not meet expectations, even though a majority of your job you did well, but the one that was considered the most important, the results were just not there. And that's why I have a sign behind me that says results matter. Because at the end of the day, you have to have the results. You could be a nice person, which is important, but you also need to be a person who meets and or exceeds the expectations of your job, and that comes into play in the determination of your overall rating. So we've talked about the appraisal form itself. We talked about the ratings of the appraisal form. The other aspect, the second aspect that we talked about in relation to the evaluation form, was related to communication. And this evaluation form is a communication device between employees and their supervisors, between the organization and their employees. And so it should allow in some ways for the communication, we would say even the natural communication, between an employee and their supervisor. Part of that is accomplished by having sections within the evaluation where we allow for open comments. We call this the narrative section. It's actually quite small. You'd be surprised. Some people think that there needs to be quite a bit of writing in an evaluation. As an aside, we don't have to write too much. We don't have to include much information in an evaluation when an employee is doing their job, meeting their expectations. Some people would say that may be seen as unfair. If an employee is doing well, we should spend quite a bit of time lauding over how well they've done. You can certainly do that. But if somebody is doing everything that they need to do, a simple and straightforward acknowledgement of how they're meeting their expectations and exceeding their expectations, I think would be sufficient. To spend an exorbitant amount of time detailing how well they've done it and how appreciative you are, I think may not be the best use of your time. Instead, for those employees not meeting the expectations, they certainly need more guidance and assistance so that they can meet the expectations of their position. And this is where, in the evaluation system, we're going to spend more time on this narrative or open-ended comments. So an example could be, in relation to open-ended or narrative comments, is you want to focus on the most important aspects of a person's job. So whatever those important aspects are, we're going to highlight those in the narrative format. So if using sales again, if your requirement, if an important aspect of your job is that if you increase sales 5%, then you're going to have a portion of your evaluation that says increase sales 5%. Then there's going to be room for a line or two about how well you met that expectations, and if you did not, the expectations in the next quarter, if it's a quarterly system. The reason why we have a smaller open-ended or narrative section of our employee evaluation is because we want to focus on the most important aspects of the job, and secondly, we want to make sure that we synthesize our information so that we're quite direct in the manner in which we converse with our employees, whether that's in the written or the oral format. It's no different than what we do in school. The days of writing 5 and 7 and 10-page papers are rapidly coming to a close because we don't use that type of communication device in the workplace either. There's not many times that we as an employer are going to have to write a long paper to our employer. People don't have time to read that information, and what they want instead is for their employees to summarize only the most important information. A good example is this PowerPoint slide from the Chicago Business Press. Notice that there's really only 2 main bullets on that slide, and there's no more than 3 sub-bullets. So the whole slide has 7 bullets, and there's probably no more than 30 words on this page. In fact, in the bullets itself, there's probably 25. So not many words, but it gets across what we feel is important to get across in a very succinct manner. We want to do the same thing in an evaluation. There may be 2 bullets or 2 sections that allow for this open-ended comments, this narrative section. But outside of that, there is not a tremendous amount of written information on an evaluation. Therefore, it doesn't take much time. It's not a laborious process for a supervisor to write the evaluation. It's very direct, succinct, and to the point. We go into the evaluation process intending to identify the most important information, and we leave that process knowing that these are the 1 or 2 or 3 things that are most important that we must concentrate on in order to ensure that we're meeting the expectations of that supervisor in that position. For that reason, the open-ended section is usually about 1/4 of the evaluation tool. I would say that evaluation tools now are about a page, certainly no longer than a page. When I say a page, by the way, that's indicative of the length of an evaluation tool. Many are, in fact, most of our evaluations are done online. That allows us to send the information quite easily. It allows us to adapt the information quite easily. And it also provides a permanent storage of the evaluations that you have received. But if you were to print out the evaluation, which I encourage you to do if you can, again, so you can utilize in your subsequent jobs, it's about a page online. So if you look at the actual tool itself, and we'll do another presentation on what an actual tool looks like. If we look at the tool, it's going to have about 3/4 of the page which are going to be checkbox. More trait theory or even behavioral theory, which talks about the specific aspects of your job that are important and allows the supervisor to make a quick and direct checks. The last part, of course, is where you have a narrative form, and in the narrative form, you're going to be talking about 1 or 2 aspects that are the most important. So that allows us to look at the type of evaluation that we have. It allows us to look at how often we should do these appraisals, and then it talks about the specific content within the appraisals. We should be doing appraisals on a quarterly basis. We should utilize the tool for a communication device between the employer and the employee. We should allow within the evaluation system a high degree of checkboxes or very quick answers, and then have some narrative aspects to it. If we create that type of form, if we have that type of conversation, and if we do it within that type of time period, we really could have a communication device that works well with our employees, that facilitates the natural communication between an employer and an employee. And it could result in some fantastic consequences. One is the employee is much more aware of the expectations of their position. So there's no guesswork or uncertainty related to their expectations. 2, especially given the more frequent basis that these forms are given to employees and this conversation occurs, it's going to develop a more positive relationship between a supervisor and their employee. By positive, it doesn't necessarily mean that each is going to agree with the evaluation, but the conversation has an ability to develop more into relationships. So there's a better understanding is how I would relate this relationship. There's a better understanding between the two. I think that's going to result in more positive repercussions. And lastly, the most important aspect of a performance appraisal system is that there's going to be a greater awareness of the expectations of the supervisor and the performance of the employee, and that's going to ensure that the performance of the employee is directed towards the organizational goals. Each person is going to understand their role in meeting the organization's expectations, and if each employee knows their expectations and meets their expectations, the organization as a whole is going to meet their expectations as well. I look forward to our next conversation, everybody. Enjoy the day.